Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the May 26, 2021 special board workshop of the Chino Valley Fire District Board of Directors. The time is 2 o'clock. This is Vice President Mike Krieger, and we will now begin the meeting. Please be advised that this meeting will be recorded. Please silence your cell phones and devices to reduce background noise or disruption. In accordance with California Governor's Executive Order N-29-20, guidance from the California Department of Public Health, and in an effort to combat the spread of COVID-19, the Chino Valley Fire District will hold all regular and special meetings of the Board of Directors remotely in a hybrid format until further notice. This meeting of the Board of Directors is being held remotely. There will be no physical meeting location. I'll now ask for a roll call. When I call your name, please answer. Director Wynn Williams.
Wynn Williams is here. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Harvey Luth.
Present. Thank you.
Director John DeMonico.
Present.
And President Sarah Ramos-Evinger.
Present.
And Mike Krieger, myself, is present as well. If everybody would please join me in the flag salute. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to
the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation,
under God, indivisible,
with liberty
and justice for all.
Justice for all.
Now it's time for the invocation. Would Henry Aguilar, our Fire District Chaplain, please join us to present the invocation?
Good afternoon, everyone. Let us pray. Lord God, we come before you at the foot of your throne and ask in Jesus' name for your blessings to be upon our special board workshop meeting. May your Holy Spirit bless our board of directors, fire administration, and fire district. We pray for peace, wisdom, and direction as we discuss the items on the agenda. We thank you for your continuous blessings upon our city, and may we always pray your will be done. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you very much, Chaplain Aguilar. Clerk of the board, do we have any changes to the agenda?
We have no changes to the agenda.
Excellent. It's time for public communications. This is the time and place for the general public to address the board of directors about subjects that do not appear elsewhere on the agenda. The public may address items on the agenda at the time addressed by the board. Due to board policy and Brown Act requirements, action may not be taken on any issue not on the agenda. When you address the board, please state your name and address prior to making your remarks. Please limit your comments to 5 minutes. Clerk of the board, do we receive any requests to speak?
We have no request to speak.
All right, well, we will be adjourning to closed session. Before I adjourn to the open session and closed session portion of the meeting, I will read the closed session items. There's a list of them here, so stick with me here. The first one, conference with labor negotiator. Meet with the board previously appointed negotiators. Fire Chief Jim Shackelford, Finance Director Steve Heide, Human Resources Director Chrissy Kuchwara, and Oliver Lee from LCW regarding negotiations between the Chino Valley Professional Firefighters Local 3522 Safety Unit and the Chino Valley Fire District per Government Code Section 54957.6. Conference with labor negotiator. Meet with the board previously appointed negotiators regarding negotiations between the Teamsters Local 1932 non-safety unit employees and the Chino Valley Fire District per Government Code Section 54957.6. Conference with labor negotiator. Meet with the board previously appointed negotiator. This one is just Oliver Lee, LCW, regarding negotiations between the unrepresented management employees and the Chino Valley Fire District per Government Code Section 54957.6. In conference with labor negotiators, meet with the board previously appointed negotiators, Fire Chief Tim Shackelford, Finance Director Steve Heide, and Human Resources Director Chrissy Kuchwara and Oliver Lee regarding negotiations between the unrepresented confidential and part-time employees in the Chino Valley Fire District per Government Code Section 54957.6. Clerk of the board, do we receive any public comments on the closed session items?
We have no comments on this item.
I will now adjourn the open session to closed session. We will return to open session at 4:00 p.m. once the closed session is concluded. Meeting attendees should now disconnect from this GoToWebinar link. When the closed session adjourns, we will return to open session to report out of closed session. Board members should now disconnect from this GoToWebinar link and use your telephones to dial into the secure telephone number provided by District Legal Counsel. When the closed session adjourns, you will join the same GoToWebinar link for sound check and stay on until open session begins. After the sound check, remember to keep your microphones muted till the meeting begins. And with that, we will close this portion. Good afternoon again. The time is 4:14. This is Vice President Mike Krieger, and I will now reopen the meeting to open session and take a roll call. Please answer when I call your name. Director Wynn Williams.
I'm here.
Director Harvey Luth.
Present.
Director John DeMonico.
Present.
President Sarah Ramos-Evander.
Present.
And I'm here obviously as well. Please be advised that this meeting will be recorded. Please silence your cell phones and devices to reduce background noise or disruption. In accordance with the California Governor's Executive Order N-29-20, guidance from the California Department of Public Health, and in an effort to combat the spread of COVID-19, the Chino Valley Fire District will hold all regular and special meetings of the Board of Directors remotely in a hybrid format until further notice. This special meeting of the Board of Directors is being held remotely. There will be no physical meeting location. There is nothing to report out of closed session. Old business, none. New business, the 2021-22 original budget workshop. The purpose is to conduct a 2021 to 2022 original budget workshop to provide for budget input and direction to staff. Finance Director Steve Heide, please present your reports.
Well, good afternoon, Vice President Krieger, President Ramos-Evander, and members of the board. We're going to start this afternoon with a brief PowerPoint presentation and thereafter move into the budget document. But I'll start with a recommendation from today's report. So it's recommended that the board receive the budget input and provide direction to staff regarding the fiscal year 22 draft original budget. So today we're looking really for your input and direction in anticipation of bringing back a final budget product on June 9th for the board's approval. So with that, we'll go ahead and move through the PowerPoint. And if at any point during my presentation there are questions or comments from board members, we're happy to address those as we move through the presentation. So with that, again, welcome everybody. Next slide, if we could, please. So just a brief reminder, this is what I term rather heavy lift in terms of all of the districts moving through the budget development process. And as indicated on the graphic you see there in front of you, this really is about a 6-month process from the kickoff of the project in mid-December to the anticipated board approval on June 9th. Next slide, please. So today's workshop is really an interactive opportunity to receive feedback and direction from the board, also to solicit public comment. Next slide, please. And so just a brief reminder in terms of sort of the general format of the budget document. There are certain key sections, first few of which are highlighted here on this slide. Next slide, please. And so we'll take some time reviewing a good number of these sections and going through in a fair amount of detail. But again, as we move into the document itself, if there are any specific questions as we move through, please don't hesitate to stop me at any point, and we'll try to get those questions addressed and or address any the comments or observations the board may have. Next slide, please. So just a few items of significance that are still being worked through with regard to the draft budget and next year's fiscal condition. As we will discuss in some detail, just a reminder that negotiations with our labor groups are ongoing. And so the current draft 22 budget does not contemplate any assumptions with regard to changes in pay and benefits, which are subject to negotiation. Additionally, the Station 8 project is currently in a due diligence phase with the city of Chino Hills. So there are some potential unknowns with regard to fiscal impact next year and beyond with regard to that construction project. And then finally, with regard to strategic goals, if we could flip one more slide forward. So our government finance officer organization standards, as the board is well aware, we submit our budget for award consideration to GFOA annually. And so new standards have come out starting with the fiscal 22 budget. And the last time GFOA updated their standards for the budget award program was 10 years ago. So there are quite a few changes, and we'll see some of those reflected in the document here in a few minutes. But GFOA is requiring high-level overarching organizational goals. And so we've incorporated, some goals reporting on a continuing basis in the budget. But I think with the board's direction, we would like to, at some point here in the next few months, start a strategic goals initiative specific to the budget document. And I've listed a couple of examples here of overarching goals. And so what we're really looking for ideally through this process is probably three to five overarching high-level goals, which would largely be consistent with the district's mission, vision, and values. And then from there, we'll continue to fashion and fine-tune goals at the department levels that are consistent with these overarching goals. But this is something that we need to formally entertain as part of meeting the ongoing GFOA standards. So just wanted to plant that seed, and we'll look to agendize with the board's approval some future agenda time to further develop this. So next slide, please.
Hey, Steve, this is Wynn. Steve, what's
Yes.
GFOA?
It's a Government Finance Officers Association. So it's the national organization for finance professionals that provides a national standard for transparency and best practices in both financial reporting and budget reporting. And so we've been participating for a number of years in the GFOA programs. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Steve, thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions before we move into the budget document itself? If not, I think we're ready to flip the switch here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you see there the budget cover, 21-22 original budget. And again, we're going to move through this in some sequential order, not addressing all of the 164 pages, thankfully, but certainly covering it in sufficient detail to provide a very thorough overview. And again, at any point, if there are questions, please pause me and we'll get started with that. So just a quick reminder that in terms of the budget document itself, Obviously, we're looking at an electronic version. So if you were pulling this up, for example, through the website, this draft has been posted on the district website for some time. You would see that this table of contents has hyperlinks. And so, for example, if we wanted to look at the org chart on page 53, we could hyperlink to this section. You can have it in a 2-page format like I'm presenting here today, and quickly move back and forth in the budget by, again, clicking on the relevant section, personnel listing, for example, and then going back to the table of contents. So just a little reminder in terms of navigating through the document. So looking here at the beginning, right after the table of contents, we have, starting on page 6, the transmittal letter. And it contains a wealth of information. It's really a comprehensive overview of the budget document and the state of the district's budget for fiscal 22. And so really encourage those participating today to, if you've not had the time to go through this in detail, to certainly take time on the transmittal, because it really does provide, I think, a very comprehensive summary. And so if you look there on page 7, right at the top, we comment on fire and emergency responses. And if you look to the far right of that graph in chart 1, you see that our call volume for 2020 was substantially flat in relation to 2021, whereas in general, you see the trend since 2011 of continuing increases in call volume. We believe that largely was associated with what we refer to as the COVID phenomenon, meaning that by and large, some of the garden variety responses, particularly in the medical aid area, were not being provided because call volume was down due to patients' perception of additional COVID risk if they were to have to be transported to the hospital. So in that respect, I think these are largely consistent with, aside from COVID issues, what most healthcare facilities and providers were experiencing in terms of some of the routine and elective types of medical issues. Obviously, true emergencies continued to come in and be responded to, but some of the less severe, lower acuity calls more likely were not made due to COVID. So moving into the section right below that, excellence, transparency, and public trust. Just a reminder again that we do participate in the GFOA Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting, as well as at the top of page 8, the Distinguished Budget Presentation Award Program. We've been doing that for a few years now and are pleased that we've been awarded each year that we've applied for these awards, and also take great pride and kudos to the board that we continue to maintain our accreditation through the Special District Leadership Foundation as a Platinum District of Distinction. That is a very exclusive and prestigious honor, and there are rigorous standards that have to be achieved and maintained in order for the district to do that. Again, I think that those awards collectively demonstrate this board and this district's commitment to being transparent and valuing the public trust above all else. On the bottom of page 8, we do start in that section to talk about potential fiscal uncertainties heading into the 22 budget. Certainly the potential unknowns with COVID, were there to be a significant rebound into a shutdown type environment, could have fiscal impact on the district, particularly if there was widespread economic fallout associated with that. There also are some unknowns there indicated in the middle of page 9 with regard to interest rates. Certainly, for those of you that have accounts that are fixed interest CD type accounts or interest bearing savings, checking, investment accounts, you know we're in almost a zero rate return environment. So certainly that has some impact on the district's ability to generate returns within the safety of the limited government code obligations that we have. And there's also some question about inflation. Is it, we have been over the past year or so in a very low inflation environment associated with that. There are some economic concerns potentially in the short term that we could see some spikes in inflation. So those are some unknowns, and we'll talk in a bit more detail in specific about the low inflation effect on our property tax growth for next fiscal year. So more to come on that in just a moment. Looking at the top of page 10, again, a reminder there in that first paragraph that labor negotiations are ongoing. The current MOUs expire at the end of this fiscal year, June 30. And so we have not contemplated any additions to the budget with regard to those changes, as we can't reasonably estimate any provision for change in paying benefits at this time. Additionally, Station 8, as mentioned in the PowerPoint presentation, we are in a due diligence period with the city of Chino Hills to build Station 8. The tentative agreement calls for the city to provide $8 million in funding for the district to construct and equip Station 8 in Chino Hills. There, partially through COVID and partially not, have been continuing increases in construction and supply costs, both on the labor side and in terms of raw materials. Part of that is potentially a COVID factor in the short term, but may indicate a trend in the longer term toward higher expense for building public type facilities in particular. We really won't know until we put those out to bid. That's assuming that final agreements are made after the due diligence period. So there are some unknowns potentially if construction costs extend beyond the 8 million mark, combined with the equipment associated with Station 8. So at this point, we have not included any additional provision for costs, which could potentially begin to be incurred this next fiscal year. So page 11, and by the way, I'm going to go through the transmittal in a fair amount of detail, but not necessarily all of the document. So just bear with me if you would, but any questions at any point, again, feel free to interject. So with those unknowns, we highlighted on the previous page and in the first few minutes of our discussion here, just also want to indicate on the flip side of that, as indicated on the top of page 11, that thankfully we do have substantial reserves for emergency contingency and the unassigned portions of fund balance. So we're projecting at the end of this next fiscal year, June 30, 22, combined balances between those two funds of about $16.4 million, approximately 35% of the expenditure side of the fiscal 22 budget. So while we have some unknowns, and certainly there could be fiscal impacts from other emergency type situations at any point, of course, we do have sufficient reserves earmarked and committed for those purposes. So that certainly puts us in a position to be well prepared to deal with any unknowns. Moving into the new in this year section, we will not have as capital intensive requirement in this budget as we have in some prior budgets, particularly this current fiscal year. But we do have some key projects and acquisitions and initiatives moving forward. So a few of those are just highlighted here, but in particular, a significant initiative to replace our computer services and our storage infrastructure to the tune of about $170,000. It's also triennial uniform replacement time at a budget of about $140,000. I'm also pleased to indicate that in the bounce back from COVID and all of that, that we are anticipating a return to normalcy with regard to our mission critical training and have the better part of $300,000 earmarked toward those important trainings for staff compared to about 2/3 of that amount in the current budget. So moving forward here to the top of page 14, we have a table that shows the 5-year summary budget. And so just a couple of numbers I want to bring your attention to. This is a balanced budget, meaning that operating revenues are sufficient, in this case actually more than sufficient, to cover our operating expenditures. So if you look about 3/4 of the way down that table 1, you see the net change in fund balance in a dark blue shading. Far right-hand column, the 22 original budget, about $2.8 million revenue over expenditures. And when you add in the transfers from capital replacement, which is our depreciation fund for funding capital, those two combined deliver net operating revenues of about $2.9 million. And so, that is about where we thought we would be in the long-range financial plan, reflecting back on a year ago. It's actually a little bit higher again because we don't yet have the structural costs associated with negotiated changes in pay and benefits. For this next fiscal year, we anticipate that we'll be banking a few dollars and adding to fund balance in anticipation of taking on additional costs that we'll discuss further with regard, further in this process with regard to taking on Station 8, as well as some additional pension challenges that loom in the future. Those two issues in particular, adding to the structural budget over the next several years. So just moving forward here into chart 4 at the top of page 15, you see our overall revenues are largely flat from the 21 budget to the 22 budget, looking to the far right-hand side of that chart. And so you'll hear a lot of reference in the discussion to a spike in our mutual aid recoveries in the current fiscal year. This 21 budget reflects, I think, an all-time high in terms of recoverable revenues from mostly out-of-district mutual aid responses. And we don't expect those to recur in the 22 fiscal year. It's difficult to project from year to year what that level of activity is, but that has not only the direct impact on revenues that we're talking about here, but also the associated labor costs, in particular overtime costs associated with those events. That's obviously, or maybe not obviously, the basis for the reimbursement is the costs that we're incurring to staff those emergency out-of-area events. So with that, looking then to page 16, shifting gears here a little bit to property tax related revenues, you see that although in chart 4 our overall revenues are static from this year to next, we are seeing increases in property tax revenues. I referred earlier to the low inflation environment. So for those of you that may not be aware, under Proposition 13, which largely governs property taxes here in the state of California, assessed property values for those properties that either are not improved, which would trigger a reassessment by the county, or resales of property, which again would trigger a reassessment. If for continuing valuations where there is no reassessment, under Prop 13, we're allowed up to a 2% increase in the base value of those properties. And because of the low inflation environment, the 22 property taxes from the current sort of base year assessed values will only increase 1% versus the 2% maximum. And so that translates into about a 3.8% projection in increases in property tax revenues versus had we received the full 2% allocation and growth, that would have amounted to about a 5.2% growth factor. So, fairly significant in terms of the growth in non-sold property or not unimproved property for next fiscal year. So let me flip my page here just so I can catch up. So looking to table 2 and table 3, you see that the property tax revenues with that are anticipated to the far right-hand side to increase about 1.7 million. Conversely, on other revenues, will be decreasing about 2.1 million. And so the story with the other revenues is there in the mutual aid recoveries, going from about 2.6 million projected this year to about $500,000 built into next year's budget. So that translates to about a $2 million reduction in revenue. But as we talk about when we move into the expenditure area, that does also have a corresponding reduction on the labor side, in particular on overtime costs. So as mutual aid goes up, labor costs go up, and also in the opposite direction as those mutual aid events and activities decrease, then we naturally see a corresponding decrease in labor costs since we're not incurring the primarily overtime costs associated with staffing those. So looking to the expenditure section there as we flip to the next couple of pages. On the salary and benefits side, we are expecting, if you look at chart 7 there, a lower level of vacancies and open positions. We track that both in terms of work comp, illnesses and injuries, and regular vacancies. And so we are anticipating a significantly lower level of vacancies. Basically, we project when we finish this fiscal year, we'll be close on average to about 13 vacancies over the course of the year. We filled a number of positions here recently, and thankfully the work comp activity seems to be modestly trending down. So with that, we would expect a higher level of regular salaries as indicated in table 4. That's the main basis for the increases in regular pay at 2.3% you're seeing in the right-hand column. And then right below that, you see the coverage costs for overtime decreasing by 7%. So the coverage costs is dependent and reflective of the reduction in open positions, but B, also associated with the anticipated reduction in mutual aid. So with that, we are projecting, again, not inclusive of any changes in pay and benefits associated with negotiations, a decrease in salaries and benefits in the current budget. So with regard, just one other point with regard to retirement costs, we'll move in a little more detail in a few minutes on that. But you might look at that and say, well, we're always showing that retirement costs are driving an 0.8% change in our salary and benefit expenditures. That's true, but part of that is in the fact that the board authorized in April an additional discretionary payment toward pension obligations of $670,000. So that is obviously not a part of ongoing annual minimum costs, but it does add to the 21 budget. So if you adjusted out that $670,000, the retirement costs on a sort of equal basis comparing the current fiscal year to next fiscal year would actually be driving about a 2.4% adjusted increase in salary and benefits costs. So again, more about that here. Oh, sorry about that. Let me move back. So more about that here on these pages that follow. But first, I wanted to talk about services and supplies. We are anticipating modest increase. That number is 2.4. Actually, it should be 2.7. I need to correct that graph, but about 176,000 in net increases in service and supply items, most significantly the uniform replacement, which we discussed currently. So, typically we're expecting about a 2 to 3% change in services and supplies, so no great shakes there. And then talked a little bit earlier about capital requirements being significantly lower in the 22 budget, about 475,000 this fiscal year, and a couple of those items are listed, and we've already discussed the server and storage infrastructure in particular. So moving on to 22, continuing pension mitigation, the graph listed there in chart 8 shows the employee pension cost sharing contributions that have been made since cost sharing was initiated back in 14-15. The blue portion of that bar are classic retiree employees, retiree eligible employees, and the sort of brownish bar at the bottom of those represents the HEPRA employees. HEPRA was initiated in 2013 as a more modest level of benefits, and so in combination between our HEPRA and our classic contributions, $13.7 million in aggregate have been or will be by the end of this next fiscal year contributed toward pension obligations. So that's a huge number. And so any of the pension costs that we share with you today with regard to the budget are net of those costs. So one can only imagine how the pension crisis might reflect on the district were we not to be receiving those ongoing pension cost sharing contributions, which are detailed there at the top of page 23 in terms of how that works, safety and miscellaneous. Moving into the section below that, the section 115 trust, talked a little bit about the discretionary payment that the board authorized in April. So in late fiscal 17, the district entered into a section 115 trust with a $5 million deposit at the board's direction. This allows the district to develop essentially like a sort of side retirement savings fund. Those funds are restricted in nature and can only be used to fund pension obligations. And so, as we indicate there at the end of that first paragraph in the 115 trust section, as of April 30th, the trust stood at about 7.9 million. Pleased to just update that further. And as of last Friday, the 21st, the retirement trust stood at $8.2 million. And so just as sort of a comparison, had the district opted to not enter into the 115 trust and instead been subject to the limitations of the government code with regard to safety and preservation of principal in this continuing low interest rate environment, staff would project that the investments that we've made in the 115 trust today would be worth about 5.9 million versus the 8.2 that we've identified as of May 21st. So about a $2.3 million difference in terms of taking those monies outside of the general fund, investing those in a more responsible way with regard to our pension obligations, having that flexibility of being able to take it outside of the general fund has obviously been a very good thing. We certainly have a ways to go, but you know, in essentially 4 short years, we've been able to accumulate in excess of $2 million more in that fund than if we would have not have had the direction from the board to initiate that 115 trust. So very pleased to be able to provide that information. And I will probably add an additional graphic to illustrate that before we finalize the budget next month. So looking to page 24, we talk in the graphic at chart 9 about the continuing increases in pension costs. So you can see the pension costs in absolute dollars continuing to increase, including in the 22 budget. And you also see as a percentage of labor costs that that trend is since about 2019 continuing to increase. And as we move into the next set of tables on 25 and 26, the top table 6 shows from our CalPERS actuarial valuations that are the most recently available that our unfunded actuarial liability contributions, which tend to drive those, the majority of those pension increases, are about 3.8 million in the 22 budget, and expected over the next 5 or so years to jump to about 5 million in just 5 short years. So the 115 trust and other strategies to continue to try to get ahead of, or at least keep pace with those continuing increases in pension costs will be critical. Table 7 shows since inception with the 115 trust in late fiscal 17 that we've contributed about 5.6 million into the trust, and we've also paid an additional about 1.3 million directly to CalPERS, and those have a direct impact over time into the UAL contributions that are reflected in table 6. So the numbers there in table 6 partially reflect the impact of the additional contributions, but for example, the 21 contributions that are reflected in table 7 won't be figured into the actuarial until essentially not this next actuarial valuation, but the one after that, because of the timing. So, you know, with that, just fantastic that we have done the things we've done to try to stay ahead of the pension issue, but more work to be done. If you look there at the top of page 26, table 8, you can see that June 30, 18, which is our prior valuation, versus June 30, 19, which is the most current PERS valuation. This reflects the overall funded ratio of the district's plans. You can see they slightly increased on the important plans, which are the classic plans, because those contain far and away the majority of employees. So that we did modestly increase the funded ratio. Conversely, I would expect when the June 30, 20 valuation comes out here this summer, that we'll see that the funded ratios have decreased, because at June 30, 20, PERS returns, as you may recall, were less than the assumed 7%, primarily because of market downturn associated with COVID. So the flip side of the June 30, 20 valuation is that when the numbers are posted and we get the June 30, 21 valuation for the current fiscal year, I would expect those ratios to bounce back, because all indications are that at this point is that PERS will potentially significantly outpace the 7% returns, but that remains to be seen based on what the actual fiscal year returns are at a point in time on June 30 of this fiscal year. So with that, I'm going to jump forward a couple of pages here into our financial trends section, starting on page 31. The graph there, trends in total revenue, again shows total revenues are largely flat. You see that the property taxes, the red line portion of that chart, shows a dip in the proportion of revenue from property taxes in fiscal 21. And again, the reason for that is the jump up in mutual aid. So since mutual aid, i.e. other revenues, represented a somewhat higher proportion of the budget, that then naturally drove down the portion of the budget in 21 associated with property taxes. So that's why you see that dip in fiscal 21, but jumping back up again more into that 95 to 96% range, which is much more typical, anticipated in fiscal 22. And we talked about property taxes a bit earlier. And again, recognize that, while the average annual increase over the last decade in property taxes has been about 5.8%, we're only looking at 3.8. And again, if we adjusted that for the inflationary calculation, we'd be projecting about 5.2%. So, on an adjusted basis, slightly lower than what we've experienced over the last decade. Admittedly, we do project those numbers somewhat conservatively because that is prudent in nature to not necessarily build the expenditure side of your budget up to an absolute sort of highly optimistic view in terms of your potential for revenues. On page 33, the graphic there, other revenues, again, you see the significant drop off between 21 and 22 in other revenues. And again, the tail of the story is the decrease in mutual aid. Also in the graphic on the top of page 34, total expenditures, you see the total from salaries and benefits dropping down in 21 and then back up in 22. That's a combination, again, of the change in overtime associated with mutual aid and the anticipated lower level of vacancies next fiscal year. Salary and benefit expenditures on 35, you see a general trend toward in particular, pension benefit expenses increasing as an overall percentage of budget. We talked a bit about that in prior slides, but we would expect that trend to continue largely for the next 10 to 12 years before it finally hits peak and begins to come back down in combination with the district's accelerated pension payments and the transition in the overall system shift from classic employees to more based on the PEPRA employees at an overall lower cost. Looking on page 36 there with regard to retirement costs, comparing in specific 21 and 22 budgets. The lightest blue bar portion of the bar at the top of the 21 budget shows the additional discretionary payment of $670,000 made this fiscal year. So if you're able to level those two out and just look at the dark blue bar and the medium bar, you do see that they're exclusive of the ADC. There are continuing increases in pension costs. And on a related note, the board has directed staff to come back mid next fiscal year to entertain the potential to make additional discretionary payments, even though we haven't specifically built anything into this budget. This budget only reflects those additional discretionary payments, which would be required by policy. So our policy requires that 1/3 of any surplus be earmarked in the next fiscal year for advanced discretionary payment, either to CalPERS directly or under the 115 trust. But since the 21 budget, primarily because the capital requirements does not anticipate a surplus, therefore we haven't built an ABC into the 22 budget. On the staffing side, you see there in the graphic that since 2019, we have not added any positions. And so those numbers are flat for 2021 and anticipated at the same level for 2022. And when you look at non-payroll expenditures on page 38, we talked about capital requirements being extensive. That is the lighter blue bar. You can see the capital requirements were substantial, primarily because of foreign engine purchases in fiscal 21. And fiscal 22, we're all anticipating about $500,000 in expenditures. So you see there is some historical variance where we typically have a year of heavy capital expenditures followed by a year or two potentially of lower level. A lot of that has to do with the cyclical nature of apparatus replacement. So if we will then bump forward here a bunch of pages to 58. This is the staffing overview and departmental reporting portion of the document. And again, just want to focus your attention on page 58 to the labor commitment table, which shows that our current MOUs and unrepresented resolutions expire at June 30, 21. And again, just to reemphasize that other than our projected pension increases associated with primarily unfunded actuarial liabilities, as well as any other contractual obligations we have outside of negotiated pay and benefits, MOU changes are not reflected at this point in our budgetary assumptions. So we're going to move forward further to page 95. And this just provides our budget report descriptions. So this sort of is the key to what each of the following budget reports provides in terms of the detailed information. As we move into the budget summary information, I want to bring your attention in particular to changes in fund balance on page 100. The first column toward the upper part, the fiscal 21 amended budget, shows at 7/1/20, so coming into our current fiscal year, our audited total fund balance was about $28.6 million. We anticipate a decrease in that, primarily associated with capital. So at June 30, 21, we expect that to dip to about $27 million. However, with the $2.8 million roughly in revenue over expenditure projected in this budget, we would expect to finish fiscal 22 and at June 30, 22, that total line, bottom right-hand side of page 100, that our total fund balance would be about $29.8 million. So moving into the budget detail information, want to bring your attention to the budgeted expenditure variance report. This report, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but lines or expresses line item changes. So I think it is good in terms of its analytical nature. So if you haven't had a chance to review that, please go through it.
And Steve, would you
Yeah,
mind if we took just a quick break for questions here? I have a couple regarding these pages.
Certainly.
On page 104, line 6235 work comp expense, we have $1.9 million on work comp expense. And
Correct.
then when I take a look at what you were just talking about, the variance, it shows on page 111, it shows work comp budget of 900,000. So I see, I'm wondering where the extra million went. So on one page, we have an original budget of 1.9 million, and on
So
on
going
11, it's 900,000.
So if we go back here to page 104, there are two, I mean, that's a great question because there's two integral components to workers' compensation expense. So you were referring, and we'll go back to 111 here in a second, but I think this shows it in a little more detail. You were referring to line 6037. So if you look at the 21 and the 22 columns, that represents the overtime associated with covering shifts that for members who are off work for illness and injury associated with work comp, versus line 6235, which represents our costs associated with the wage payments to employees who are off work for work comp purposes, as well as care and treatment. So those two components in total make up the deferred comp expense. So when we look here at page 111, 6037 just reflects the overtime portion of that. And we did not comment, going back to 104, in that analytical section, we did not comment on the change for 6235. So it seems a little confusing, but we're looking at the two different aspects of that. So the overtime, 6037 versus 6235, or I'm sorry, let me go back to that real quick.
So we're spending 2.8 million. So if I add those two up, that's $2.8 million in work comp a year.
Yes, versus 3.4 and projected in the current fiscal year. So significant increases in the last 3 to 4 years in our workers' comp expenses, both in combination overtime coverage and care, treatment, and wages for illness and injury associated with work comp.
That's
thankfully,
I mean, that's a massive percentage of our overall budget.
Yes, it is. It is significant. Thankfully, we are anticipating, although it's very difficult to predict from year to year, we are anticipating a slight leveling off and potential decrease in work comp. With that said, I think it's my understanding, and of course we wouldn't go into detail on any individual cases, but unfortunately in the last, I think, couple of months, we have seen a little uptick back toward that trend. But yes, those are significant increases that we've experienced. So if you go back, and again, I don't want to make anybody sort of seasick with going back and forth, but if you look at 6037, the coverage or overtime, you see in 2018 we were a little under a $500,000. 2019 we were a little over, and it's about doubled. It about doubled in 2020, and similar levels anticipated in 21 when we finished the year. A slight decrease in 22, and then going down to the 6235. Again, you see the trend toward more than double. We were at just under $1 million in 6235 in 2018, and at a high in the current budget, the 21 budget at 2.3, after having ended 2020 at about 2.1 million. So we, the good news is we are expecting slight decreases in that, but no doubt we have seen over the last 4 or so years essentially a doubling of our costs in all workers' comp associated.
Yeah, I'm just
claims.
looking at,
Yeah.
It's 5% of our overall budget, and 20% of what salaries are. It's significant, 25%. So it's just a significant number. Thank you for the explanation.
Sure, no problem. Any other questions at this point in time regarding anything we've covered thus far? We
Yeah,
are
Steve.
on the home
Steve-
stretch. Sure. Director
Steve,
Luke?
yeah, I'm sorry.
Sure.
And these are very small, but at the bottom of 104, structure rent lease, what,
Sure.
and it's a small number, but I was just curious what that is.
Yeah, I don't, I'm not sure I have that 100% committed to memory, but I think that's outside storage. So we rented some temporary storage for movement between facilities.
Okay.
So I think that's a storage unit temporarily rented.
Okay. Then 6340 technology allowance. So I think,
Sure.
didn't you,
So
don't you have that on there? No.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
So if you could explain that.
yes. So previously, technology allowance would have been reported down below in services and supplies in the phone area, in the cellular phone area. You see how 7042 goes from 96.6 in fiscal 21 to 41,000 in fiscal 22, because we moved the allowance portion of those expenses into this new account 6340, with the rationale being that those are paid through payroll, so they're better reflected as a component of salary and benefits versus as a component of services and supplies. So does that make sense?
Yep. Yep. Sure does.
Okay.
I had one other, Steve, and this is just not for nothing, but page 115, 116, 117, and 118 seem to be duplicates of the
Yes.
4 pages prior.
Yes, they are. So we doubled up. We thought if we could report budget variances once, why not report it twice? No, that's just an administrative error. So we've already flagged that. Thanks for pointing that out, though, and
Yeah.
we'll clean that up in the final version.
Not a problem.
Thank you for that. We bonus points for catching that. So
I thought you put that in there just to make sure that the board members were actually looking at the document.
you passed the test. Congratulations. Thank you.
All right, so after
All right.
this, we do the breakdown stuff, and we might
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
have
So
general questions after that.
yeah. So we're now to the point of our general fund expenditure transactions over $5,000, and I'm going to continue to display my screen, but turn over the audio to Don Burns to take us through, because Don works most detailed in this area and will be happy to address any comments or questions you might have on any of the details. So I'd like to welcome Dawn and turn over the audio to her. Dawn?
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. So I thought we'd just go through this sequentially as we did with the rest of the budget, as Steve did. So what we'll do is we'll just start on page 119 and 120. If you have any questions, just pipe in and let me know. I'll wait a few moments, and if I hear no questions, we'll move on to the next page. So page 119 and 120.
Yeah, Don, this is Director Luth. On the web redesign, is that something new?
Yes. So our current web page is outdated, and we're just looking for something more relevant.
Okay, but we haven't budgeted for that in the past, and so this is a new.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see here. I think that's all I've got.
Okay. If there's no more questions, we'll move on to page 121, 122.
Are we
ahead.
buying a forklift, or do we already have one, or are we just replacing one?
We have a forklift, however, it is from 1988. It's been breaking down quite a bit. So we are looking to buy a new used forklift. The training center and support services both utilize that forklift quite a bit.
Got it.
And then on page 122, 7450 intern, IT intern, is that something new that we're adding this year, or have we been doing that?
We actually had that on the budget last year, but due to COVID, we weren't able to start that program.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, let's move on to 123, 124. Okay, 125, 126.
I had a question on 7025 clothing.
Yes.
The first item, ballistic protective body armor, 15 of those. I thought that just like a year ago or 2 years ago, we did a large purchase of updating that. Is this an ongoing item for new people, or how does that work?
Actually, we haven't bought any new ballistic equipment in 5 years. It's approaching its shelf life, so we need to replace that.
Okay, excellent.
Any other questions? 127, 128. And the final page.
I'm sorry. Can we go on?
Are we okay on these pages, or are there any questions?
Director Luth?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I know it. My mute and unmute is very slow, and I think it's not working, and I unmute and mute myself. Anyway, the exhaust systems, there's a goal to upgrade the exhaust systems, and I'm not, is that in here in this 8830, or is it somewhere else? It's 75. Do we have that budgeted somewhere that I'm just not seeing it?
Well, if I'm understanding your question, we actually have under 7450, we have money for a grant writing consultant who will help us with the exhaust removal systems at the stations. So we're hoping that that's covered under a grant, fully covered under a grant.
Okay, so that's okay. Good, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, 129, we'll move on to the last page.
All right.
And no
Thank
other,
you, Don.
thank you.
Any other questions? on
Thank you,
the
Don.
transaction detail? No. All right.
Thank
Was
you.
that a yeah, thank you. Thank you, Don. I think Vice President Krieger was echoing that as well, if I heard him correctly. So,
Thank
all
you.
right, we're on the home stretch here. 130 and 131 are the long-range financial plan overview. 132 is the long-range financial plan itself. Just wanted to circle back, just for sort of point of reference. If you look there in the column that says year 2, so again, based on the current proposed fiscal 22 budget, the sort of yellow line there toward the middle that says all revenues over or under expenditures, 2.8 million in round numbers. We projected in the long-range financial plan last year about 2.3, 2.4 million for that number. And the fact that this number in the current 22 budget doesn't reflect any salary and benefit changes tells you that we were, largely about on track what we expected. And just want to bring to the board's attention, again, this is nothing necessarily new, but as we get out toward that 10-year mark in the long-range financial plan, we are potentially looking at least for a period of possibly 2, 3, 4 years. The potential for continuing operating deficits, we do see the likelihood of recovery probably out in year 11 or year 12, but that is primarily associated with us bringing on the potential for staffing for Station 9, which is currently in the long-range financial plan in fiscal 28. Obviously, that hasn't been on the radar in terms of any serious planning or discussions in terms of how realistic that timing is. But at the point that Station 9 comes online, even if that were to be pushed out a bit, it likely will result in a period of at least a few years of leaner times. And the long-range financial plan, although the 21-22 budget does not include any assumptions on increases, the long-range financial plan for fiscal 23 and the balance of the plan does include the assumption of 2% annual increases in salary and benefit related costs. So we do build it into the long-range financial plan, even though we don't reflect it in the 1 year with regard to the current budget. And then finally, as we move into the new statistical information section, this largely reflects schedules and reports that are included in our comprehensive annual financial report. Not all of the statistical documents that are included in the comprehensive AFR are included in the budget, but GFOA did institute a recommendation that some of the budget related financial statistics be also incorporated into the budget document. Thus, we've added to the budget with the statistical section. And so with that, that concludes my report, and I'll turn it back over to Vice President Krieger for the next portion of the agenda related to this.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was fantastic. Before the board comments on this, I think I have to ask about any requests to speak. So did anybody, Sandra, did anybody give us a request to speak on this?
No, we have no request to speak on this item.
Excellent. Well, what I'd like to do is just go around to the different board members and ask them if they have any final questions for or comments for Finance Director Heidi or Don or the chief for that matter. So Director Williams, do you have any questions?
Thank you. I have no questions at this time. I think you did an excellent job as usual, and appreciate it. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Director Luth.
Thank you. I don't necessarily have any more questions. This is incredibly detailed, well presented, both in writing here in the hard copies and then again here now in our workshop. And I appreciate that. The one thing I really appreciate about this is we list goals by different departments, and I don't know how many years we've been doing this before I got here, but we've been doing that. And I'm always looking back at then comparing that to what's in the budget and where we've got changes and training. There's training. I kept seeing training was a goal in all the, seemed like everywhere, and that's increasing, and it shows that we're looking at our goals. We're trying to budget to that. When you look at the website, changing that, there's a goal here talking about more outreach and trying to increase following by 5%. There's goals tied to some of these changes. I have notes all over this thing about, okay, what goal is that? Where's that? And I just appreciate that. It helps me when I'm looking at this to make sure we're not just putting numbers down. There's reasons, there's goals, there's some intent behind some of these changes. So I appreciate the notes on the changes and why they're changing. And again, just the thorough job that you and your team do, Steve, and providing us good, clear information. I just appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a heavy lift by the finance department for sure. So kudos to my team, but also to other members of management and really the district team as a whole for supporting this process and bringing the product you see before you today.
Director DeMonico.
Yeah, great job as usual. I've only been through a couple of these, but they get better every year and very transparent. But one of the trends I do notice is that the expenditures keep going up because of the costs keep going up for certain items. So with that, I got a question that I didn't see in the budget, but I want to ask: what's the chief's signing authority or spending limit?
That's a great question. The spending limit is $25,000, and it has been for, I think, since I've been here, which is 17 years. So,
I've been here 15, and I thought that's the same thing. And I wanted to ask, and because these costs are going up and everything, and we just went through this pandemic, and I don't know how we got through it, but with the cost of the things that thing cost us, what's the opportunity or procedure to increase that spending limit now with these costs going up so significant? Can we do that as part of the budget process?
not directly. We do have a purchasing policy that would have to be amended. So we could certainly work on modifying that and, running that through Finance Committee and agendizing that for the full board, but it would just require that that policy change to be approved by the board.
Yeah, and well, I'd like to see that, especially when we have a new fire chief coming in, so that he may not feel comfortable he or she may not feel comfortable coming in and asking for it, being brand new. So maybe it's something we should do before we have a new chief.
Thank you.
My suggestion. Thank you, and again, great job on this. And as usual, probably going to win another award, huh?
Certainly hope so.
Hopefully.
So thank you.
Yeah, great job, Steve. Thank you. And Don, great job. Thank you too.
Thank you.
I kind of echo Director DeMonico's questioning of the chief spending authority. So Steve, if at our next finance meeting, if you could have that on there to discuss, to look at, I'd appreciate that.
We can agendize that for our next meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, this document just gets better and better every year, and I didn't think you could top last year's, but I really do think that you did this year, and the clarity and transparency that comes out of this is utterly fantastic. Similar to Director Luth, I particularly liked pages 60 to 80 that talked about the goals and objectives of each department. It gave me a lot more clarity on what was going on and the projects that they're working on. So it's just a fantastic document, a great overview of our district as a whole, and something to truly be proud of. So hopefully this will be another award-winning budget, and we'll see good things out of that. So with that, I thank you guys very, very much.
Thank you.
Okay, this item does not require a motion. The purpose of this item was for staff to present the report and receive any board input, which they did. It's now our time for final comment. Well, actually, we just did our final comments, right? So let me just ask for if there's any final comments. Director Williams, you have anything final to say tonight?
No, I appreciate everything that has been done. I think we had a good meeting, and hopefully we can get through this negotiations. Thank you.
Fantastic. Director Luth.
Again, Steve, Don, your whole team, everybody who's involved, just great job. Thank you.
Director DeMonico.
Yes, thank you. A great job on the budget as usual, and just kudos. But also want to wish everybody to have a safe and happy Memorial Day. No further comment.
President Evinger just recently had to get off, and she wanted me to express her thanks to staff and to Steve, to you and your crew for the fantastic document as well, and for everybody's input tonight. And I echo that as well. With that, we will adjourn the meeting to a regular meeting of the Board of Directors of the Chino Valley Independent Fire District to be held on Wednesday, June 9th, 2021 at 6:00 p.m. And with that, we'll be adjourned. Thank you, everybody.